Well, Australia, and more specifically South Australia, is home to the fourth largest copper deposit in the world, Olympic Dam, owned by BHP. It's also one of the biggest gold, silver and uranium deposits on the planet. Olympic Dam, which was discovered by Western Mining, has been producing since 1988. BHP took over Western Mining. But BHP knows there's another leg of growth to Olympic Dam, which includes expanding its smelter and refinery with a likely cost of many billions of dollars. But the final decision on whether that will go ahead isn't due until the first half of 2027. And the question now is whether Donald Trump's tariffs will cruel the economics of that massive expansion. One person who has plenty riding on BHP's decision is the South Australian Premier Peter Malinauskas, and I spoke with him a little earlier.
Well, I think we've got to be honest about the fact, Ross, that whenever we see a tariff decision of the likes that President Trump has made, it's not welcome. I think it disrupts the flow of capital in a way that isn't necessarily helpful. Having said all that, we don't believe it represents a major material risk to this expansion, simply because BHP, in conjunction with my government, are actively exploring it on the basis of massive growth in demand of copper globally, but also uranium as the world continues to produce more nuclear power, which is an important resource as well at Olympic Dam. 70% is the figure that we expect copper demand to grow by over the course of the next 25 years. And even if all of the copper mining projects globally were to reach FID, we still don't get to that number. So Olympic Dam has a major opportunity before it, provided we can make sure that the economics stack up, and certainly my government's working closely with BHP in that regard.
So your government has already had to plan via your state prosperity project to spend money to encourage this investment, which includes obviously water and electricity infrastructure. But you would be highly conscious that capital is mobile. If things change, it can move away very quickly.
Yeah, of course. And we acknowledge there's always a risk to that, which is why we've got to approach this particular investment and project in an iterative way. We've got to do it step by step, methodically, in conjunction with BHP, seeing them as a partner more than anything else, to make sure that we're working in a way that is transparent between us. But we acknowledge as a government that this is a big opportunity for our state. If we're serious about growing the state in terms of generating new wealth and new industry, we've got to play a role. We can't take a hands-off attitude. And we're very conscious of the fact that the provision of water to Olympic Dam is absolutely critical to unlock this opportunity. And that's where we see us playing a role, particularly where there is a potential shared use for this critical piece of infrastructure, because there might be other opportunities that emerge as a result of a desal plant and a pipeline of the nature that we're working on. But all of these judgments, we acknowledge, are occurring in an exceptionally complex global environment. But the flip side of that, Ross, is for those that get it right, with a genuine sense of partnership between government and capital, in this case BHP, then there is a wealth of opportunity for us. And that's what we're utterly committed to actively exploring. And we've already achieved a lot over the last 12 to 18 months, and we want to keep that work going.
Are you conscious of the speed with which your government has to make decisions to approve projects? Because that can sometimes be the key to their success or failure. We hear of some projects, for example, taking nearly 2 decades to get approval in Australia.
Yeah, and that is always a source of frustration. To the extent that the approvals are reliant upon state government, and there are a lot of them that are, we have established an expedited process. Recently, we passed legislation through our state parliament to do exactly that, with the establishment of a coordinator general for major projects such as this. That's a legislative reform that we've developed in conjunction with industry to make sure we've got it right. Look, we're working really hard in South Australia, Ross, not just in respect of the speed of approvals, but make sure that our taxing regime is low, and it is the lowest in the country. The Business Council of Australia have listed South Australia as the #1 jurisdiction in the nation to do business, and we've worked hard to achieve that through a range of reforms around tax, around the regulatory environment, but also about wanting to make sure that our outside sources of capital see us as a stable, reliable jurisdiction to partner with, because that has a particular value in a world where instability is increasingly the flavour of the month.
So what you're talking about there is a competition for capital, the competition for projects. So just explain how you see that landscape inside Australia, but also from the outside looking in when foreign capital is actually looking for projects here in Australia.
Well, look, in a world that is turning upside down around us and critical minerals, and copper is probably the most critical of critical minerals, are in demand, Australia looks like a pretty safe place to invest. And I think that's particularly true in South Australia if we can make sure that the return on that capital is maximised by reducing unnecessary costs that serve no purpose. Also, if government is serious about wanting to invest in infrastructure, we've got to have the wherewithal, Ross, to not just invest in infrastructure that is a cost to government in the terms of service delivery, but actually use our balance sheet to invest in exclusively economic infrastructure. Let me be honest, Ross, no one comes to me and knocks on my door and says, hey, Premier, can you please build us a desal plant and a 600-kilometre pipeline to move water to somewhere where no one's going to drink it? They're more interested in roads and schools and hospitals, and I get that. But governments have to have the capacity to invest in economic infrastructure to generate new wealth, so that in turn we might have some royalties coming our way into the future that allows us to invest in schools and hospitals. We've got to have the wherewithal to do both. And that's something that that we've got a political responsibility to make that argument and then deliver these projects successfully.
Well, you mentioned there the Business Council of Australia has named South Australia for 2 years running as the best state to do business in Australia. Now, that has a lot to do with not just the speed of decision making, but also the taxes you impose on business. I sort of see right now that there's almost a thrust not to reduce taxes in Australia because obviously there's social needs in this country as well. What's your own sense of trying to balance up, trying to get your economy going to grow it faster versus the need to obviously generate revenue for the greater social good?
Yeah, well, of course, governments have to be fiscally prudent, and we're running budget surpluses here in South Australia. In fact, we've just recently delivered our fourth budget, and it contains our fourth surplus. But maintaining an eye on revenues in the context of your expenses, but without having to change the revenue base, and that provides a shock to capital, is the key. I think transparency and being honest about what our responsibilities are in terms of service delivery and the costs of where we see that going into the future is important, not just to the business community, but to the electorate as well. But what we've been able to do is grow our state's economy at a pace that we're not really accustomed to in the past, and that growth in the size of the economy has negated our need to actually make changes to the tax base. So that's a pattern that we would love to maintain into the future, but of course that's always a challenge, and we have to keep an eye on the costs of the government in order to be able to have the confidence to be able to do that.
Well, the federal economy, the national economy, is barely growing, has barely got a pulse at the moment, 0.2% in the last quarter. My sense is the economic roundtable to see what can be done to try and improve that. But I just wonder whether the discussion should be as much about Australia's competitiveness, which you and I are talking about, as it is about productivity. The two surely have to go hand in hand, but competitiveness, state competitiveness, global competitiveness, they're the keys to trying to get the economy moving faster.
Yeah, competitiveness is absolutely, of course, important and as much as productivity. And what we have to do, in my view, as a country is work out where we want to be able to compete. On what basis can we outcompete our competitor jurisdictions for capital? And I think that invites Australia increasingly investing in becoming a smarter country. Our R&D base in Australia is very low in comparison to other OECD countries. Less than almost every other country, in fact, we invest in R&D. And that, of course, is at the expense of productivity and competitiveness. In order to move up the value chain and become increasingly competitive, we need to be deploying technologies and intellectual property that we generate here in Australia that is able to see us outcompete our competitors. So that is something that I hope is top of mind in the productivity roundtable that I think, to Jim Chalmers' credit, he's convened with the Prime Minister in coming weeks. Investment in R&D and seeing universities as a potential source for microeconomic reform in this country, rather than just a sort of, educator of students. We've got to see them as a potential powerhouse for economic advancement.
OK, on the subject of competitiveness, while we're there, just a final one for you. The South Australian and federal governments this week committed to a combined $275 million to keep the Whyalla Steelworks running. That's part of the $2.4 billion rescue plan. My question to you is, can the Whyalla Steelworks ever be truly competitive on a global scale?
Well, that's the challenge before us, and I don't think it's going to be an easy task, Ross. Let me be candid about that, and I've said that ever since we intervened to change the ownership of the steelworks. But the opportunity is before us by virtue of where the steelworks is located. It's located adjacent to a port and adjacent to an exceptionally high quality magnetite resource, which is an iron. When we think of iron ore, there's hematite and magnetite. Magnetite lends itself to a decarbonised version of steel making, which may make it, or even green iron, which of course is an export industry that a number of steel producing countries would be very interested in. We see that decarbonisation path necessarily requiring an increase in supply of natural gas at an economic price. And in that regard, of course, Australia does have significant gas reserves, and my government is very much an advocate of using gas as a means to decarbonise what is otherwise a very carbon intensive activity in respect to steel production. So those things, with the gas opportunity in South Australia combined with the magnetite mine and the fact that the steelworks exist adjacent to those and a port, I think is a unique opportunity if we can get the right owner of the steelworks. And this is the challenge, Ross. We don't just want a new owner of the steelworks. We want the right new owner who has the balance sheet and the wherewithal to bring all those component parts together and do something globally unique. If it is able to do that, we can have a transformation that may be globally competitive. But there's a lot that needs to happen between now and then, and I'm, for one, very grateful that the federal government's put the lion's share of that money on the table to give it a chance.
I'll tell you what, Peter Malinauskas, it's always a big picture talk when we ever have a conversation. I really appreciate it. Many thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Ross. I appreciate it. Cheers.